My wife asked me to film her rehearsing a dance for her friends. Weeks later, I accidentally replayed the video. In the mirror behind her, a man sat waiting on my bed. I knew him very well. I saved the video, put the phone in the drawer, and waited for her to come home. I recorded that video because she asked me to. One Tuesday afternoon, Sunsols came into the living room with her phone in her hand and told me she needed me to record her rehearsing a dance to send her friends. She handed me the phone, stood in front of the large bedroom mirror, and I recorded without thinking anything of it, 2 minutes and 40 seconds. I saved it, passed it to her, and went on with what I was doing. I didn't think about that video again until that November afternoon. Weeks later, when I was looking for a photograph in the camera roll and the video started playing on its own, I was going to close it. I had my thumb over the screen. Then I saw something in the mirror in the background that left my arm frozen in the air. I paused, zoomed in on the image, zoomed in again. And the man who appeared in that mirror, sitting on my bed with relaxed shoulders and crossed legs, looking at his own phone with the calm of someone who is completely in his element, was Gonzalo, my best friend of 27 years, my son's godfather. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching us from. My name is Ernesto Villanueva Ramos. I'm 52 years old. I've been married for 24 years to Sunsols Medrano's wife Fuentes, who is 48. I work as an industrial quality control supervisor at a factory on the outskirts of Salamanca, a position that took me 20 years to get and that forced me to learn to see what others don't see. Small deviations, errors hiding within seemingly normal processes, inconsistencies the untrained eye overlooks because the whole thing looks right. That's what I've been doing for decades, looking for what's wrong in places where everything seems to be in order. I never imagined that this same instinct, fine-tuned over so many years between shifts and forms of defective parts, was going to be the only tool I had left when the flaw wasn't in any machine. That November afternoon was a Saturday. Sunsols had gone out to do the grocery shopping. The house was silent, that heavy silence of autumn afternoons in Salamanca, when the light fades early and you stay still without really knowing what to do with your hands. I was looking for a photograph of my sister Consuelo's last birthday, which she'd asked me to send her for an album she was putting together. I was scrolling back through the camera roll among photos of work meetings, factory images, screenshots of emails I'd archived, so I wouldn't lose them, when my fingers slipped on the screen and opened a video of Sunsols dancing. I watched the first few seconds without paying attention. I knew her by heart in that video. She'd put on a blue t-shirt, wore her hair tied back with a hair tie she was always losing, and danced with that serious concentration she had when she did something that mattered to her. The music was a song that played a lot that summer on the car radio. I still intended to close the file, to go back to looking for Consuelo's photograph. But then my eye, that's been trained for 2 decades to detect what doesn't fit, went on its own to the background of the image toward the mirror. There was something in the mirror that wasn't part of Sunsols' dance. A shape, a seated silhouette, someone who was in that bedroom while she danced, someone I hadn't seen when I recorded the video because I was looking at the screen, focusing on Sunsols, without moving the framing a single millimeter. A presence that had been there for the 2 minutes and 40 seconds the recording lasted, and that I saved without knowing I was saving it. I paused the video, my thumb didn't tremble. That surprised me later when I remembered it calmly. It didn't tremble because I didn't know what I was looking at yet. The brain takes a second longer than the eyes to process things it doesn't want to process. I zoomed in on the image with 2 fingers. Then I zoomed in again. The resolution lost quality. The pixels opened up, but the shape was still there, clear in what mattered. A person sitting on the right side of my bed. A man, broad shoulders, dark long sleeve shirt, phone in hand, looking at the screen with the tranquility of someone waiting without impatience. Legs crossed in that specific posture I'd seen thousands of times, his right ankle resting on his left knee. A gesture so particular that I'd have recognized it in any blurry photo in the world. I recognized him before seeing his face. I recognized his shoulders. I recognized his posture, and I recognized the silver wedding band on the ring finger of his left hand, that thick, unadorned band that Gonzalo had worn since his own marriage and that I'd seen in thousands of handshakes, in thousands of toasts. in thousands of pats on the back during 27 years of friendship. Gonzalo Suarez Pedraza, 50 years old. The man who was at my wedding, the man who held my son Adrian on the day of his baptism, while the priest poured holy water on him, and I got clumsy with emotion by his side. The man I called a January night 15 years ago when my father died, and I didn't know how to tell son Sauls, and who drove from the other side of the city at 11 at night without asking me a single question. The man with whom I'd shared 27 years of confidences, dozens of problems half solved between 2 beers and conversations that dragged on without either of us looking at the clock. That man was sitting on my bed. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't tense. His body wasn't stiff like someone who knows they're doing something they shouldn't and could be discovered at any moment. He was sitting with a calmness that hit me harder than anything else I saw in that video. His shoulders completely relaxed, his body weight distributed backward, leaning against the red pillow that son Sauls and I bought at a craft fair in Avila more than 10 years ago. A decorative pillow she chose because she said the bedroom needed more color. That pillow was now behind Gonzalo's back while he waited for son Sauls to finish dancing. It was the posture of someone who knows that bedroom, who knows where the pillows are, who doesn't need to look around because he already knows what he's going to find. The living room remained silent. The afternoon light came in obliquely through the window, projecting a long strip on the wooden floor. Somewhere on the street, someone started a car, and the engine slowly drove away. I didn't move from the armchair. I don't know how long I sat with the phone in my hand, looking at that magnified frame. Maybe 2 minutes, maybe 10. Time did something strange. It stretched and compressed at the same time. Like when at the factory you find a structural flaw in a part that's been passing check for months, and suddenly you understand you didn't see it before because you were looking exactly where you were supposed to look, but the wrong time. I didn't feel anger in that first moment. What I felt was something colder than anger, an uncomfortable clarity, like when the pieces of a puzzle you had incomplete suddenly find their place, and the picture that appears isn't what you expected and you can't stop seeing it anymore, even if you want to see incomplete again. I exited the video, connected my phone to the study computer with the cable I always left in the right drawer, and copied the file into a folder I protected with an 8-digit password son Sauls didn't know. Then I deleted the copy from the phone's camera roll and made sure no trace remained in the shared family cloud gallery. I did it slowly, calmly, step by step, like when at work you document a nonconformity before reporting it. First you secure the evidence, then you decide what to do with it. I learned that at the factory many years ago, and I never thought I'd need it for something that had nothing to do with metal parts. I went back to the armchair. I put the phone on the side table, face down. The light kept coming in through the window. The silence of the house was exactly the same as before, but it wasn't the same silence anymore. It was one of those silences that take up more space than they should, that settle into the corners and don't go away whether you turn on the TV or open the window. 20 minutes later, I heard the key in the lock. Son Sauls came in with 2 grocery bags, her scarf slightly crooked, that gesture of mild exhaustion she always wore after going to the supermarket on Saturdays. She left the keys in the ceramic bowl in the entryway, like she'd been doing for 24 years, and looked at me from the living room threshold. "Have you been sitting there quietly for a long time?" she asked. "No," I replied. "I just sat down." She nodded without giving it any more thought and continued toward the kitchen. I heard the rustle of the bags on the counter, the sound of the fridge opening and closing, the weight of her steps on the kitchen floor. I heard her voice asking from there if I wanted to eat dinner soon or if I prefer to wait. I told her whatever she wanted. She replied she'd make something light, that she wasn't very hungry. And I just sat in that armchair listening to her move around the kitchen like I'd listened to for 24 years of marriage, with the image of Gonzalo's silver wedding band reflected in the mirror still fixed somewhere behind my eyes. And understanding with an accuracy that needed no confirmation that what I'd seen in that video wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of everything. And before acting, I needed to understand how far what I was looking at really went. The night shift at the factory ended at 6 in the morning, and Ernesto arrived home with the smell of metal and industrial oil clinging to his clothes. That specific smell that son Sauls said never entirely went away, even if she washed it 3 times. That was in the 90s when the supervisor position didn't exist for him yet, and he spent 8 hours standing next to the production lines, checking parts one by one with cold measuring instruments between his fingers. He'd tiptoe in so as not to wake anyone. He'd leave his shoes in the entryway and shower with barely warm water because the boiler took a while to start and he didn't want to make noise. Sunsols always woke up anyway. She'd sit up in bed with messy hair and half-closed eyes and ask him if he'd eaten anything. He'd tell her yes, although it was almost never true. She'd lie back down without saying anything else, and he'd stand for a moment in the bedroom doorway, in the dim light, watching her fall asleep again with that ease he never had. That's how the early years went. Ernesto and Sunsols met at a street party in August 1998 in her town, a small place south of Salamanca, where Sunsols' family had been for 3 generations. He'd gone with Gonzalo, who had a cousin living there, and he'd invited them to spend the weekend. Gonzalo always had a cousin somewhere. That was something Ernesto joked about with him since they met, that his family had strategically reproduced all over the province, so they'd always have a travel excuse. It was a joke they'd repeated for so many years they no longer needed to finish it. One just had to start the sentence, and the other would smile. Sunsols was there that night with a group of friends by the town fountain, wearing a white floral blouse and an expression of mild boredom that seemed more honest to Ernesto than anything he'd seen in a long time. She wasn't pretending to have a good time. She was simply there with that calm poise of someone who doesn't need to convince anyone of anything. Gonzalo was the one who spoke to them first, because Gonzalo always went first in those situations, with that ease of his for entering any conversation, as if he'd been part of it for years. Ernesto arrived later, clumsy and late, and found himself sitting next to Sunsols on the edge of the fountain, not really knowing how he got there. They talked until past midnight about unimportant things, about work, about the city, about how different it was to live in a town than this. When they said goodbye, she didn't give him her phone number, and he didn't ask for it. Gonzalo looked at him in the car on the way back with that look of disbelief he got when Ernesto did something he didn't understand. 27 years old, and you still don't know how to seal the deal, he told him. Ernesto didn't reply, but he returned to the town the following weekend with the excuse that Gonzalo's cousin had left something behind. There was nothing left behind. Sunsols was waiting for him at the same fountain. They got married in October 2000 in a small ceremony in Salamanca with both families and a few others. Gonzalo was Ernesto's best man, as was logical, and as the two had assumed for years, without needing to discuss it. By that point, they already had 13 years of friendship since they met in vocational training at 18 with the sole goal of getting a decent job as soon as possible. Both came from families with little money and a strong desire for their children not to repeat the same thing. That united them more than anything else, that shared understanding of what it cost to build something from the bottom. The first years of the marriage were financially difficult, in a way that today, looking at them from a distance, Ernesto recognized as formative. The country was coming out of the 90s crisis with a hangover. The factory job paid just enough, and Sunsols had temporarily left her administrative job to take care of Adrian, who was born in the autumn of 2002 with mild neonatal jaundice that kept him in the hospital for 5 days with a heavy heart. Ernesto remembers those 5 days with a strange clarity. The white hallway of a neonatology ward, the sound of the machines, the watered-down coffee from the third-floor vending machine, which he drank enough of to never want it again. And he remembers Gonzalo showing up on the second day with a bag of homemade food his mother had prepared because she knew Ernesto wasn't eating. Nobody had asked him to do that. He simply did it. That was Gonzalo. That was the version of him that Ernesto had known and trusted for decades. Adrian left the hospital healthy. He grew up in that Salamanca apartment with the quiet determination of children who observe more than they speak. He got reasonable grades without anyone pressuring him too much. He had a small, stable group of friends, and from a young age showed that ability to manage on his own. Only that generated sorrow and a pang of guilt in Ernesto, because he understood that children who learn to manage alone do so because adults aren't always there when they should be. And Ernesto hadn't always been there. That was something he recognized without needing to dramatize it. The long shifts, The years of continuous training to get the promotion, the weeks when he came home with his body closed in on itself, and the sole goal of sleeping 6 hours before starting again. Sun Tzu's carried more than was fair during those periods, and he knew it. And the two had found an unspoken balance that worked precisely because neither put into words what the other owed them. The domestic routine of those years had a specific texture that Ernesto could reconstruct with his eyes closed. The smell of coffee in the kitchen at 7 in the morning, the radio on with the news in the background while Sun Tzu prepared Adrian's breakfast. And in the evenings when she started preparing dinner, something Ernesto had seen so many times he'd stopped seeing it. Sun Tzu would dance in the kitchen, not formally or consciously, but that small, continuous movement people make when they like a song and their hands are busy. Her feet keeping the beat on the kitchen floor, her shoulders barely moving, her head tilted, an old radio on the windowsill that always tuned to the same station. It was something so daily, so hers, that Ernesto had incorporated it into the inventory of things that made up the home without assigning it any special weight. It was just Sun Tzu's dancing while she cooked. It was just one of the things she did. He never imagined that this same gesture filmed in a bedroom weeks ago was going to be what changed everything. Gonzalo, for his part, remained a constant and frictionless presence in their lives during all those years. He came over for dinner every few weeks. He played with Adrian when he was little with that patience Ernesto sometimes silently envied, because Gonzalo had a natural ease with children that he couldn't quite find. When Adrian turned 3 and Sun Tzu's organized a small party at home, it was Gonzalo who blew up balloons for 40 minutes straight without complaining. When the boy went through that phase at 7 or 8, when he only wanted to talk about football, it was Gonzalo who sat with him to watch the matches with an attention that Ernesto, who'd never followed football with much enthusiasm, couldn't match. There was a moment from that time that Ernesto remembered sometimes for no apparent reason. A winter afternoon, Adrian must have been 9 or 10. The three of them were watching something on television, and Sun Tzu came in with 3 mugs of hot chocolate and handed them out, sitting between the two men with the naturalness of someone who occupies exactly the place where she belongs. Gonzalo said something that made everyone laugh, one of those comments of his that arrived at the exact right moment. And Ernesto remembered thinking in that instant that this was what he had, a life built with patience and without great fuss that worked because the pieces fit together. It was around that time, about 12 or 13 years ago, when Ernesto gave Gonzalo a copy of the apartment key. They'd had a minor incident. Sun Tzu had locked her keys inside, and Ernesto was 2 hours away from Salamanca for work. They had to call a locksmith who charged an amount that irritated them both. The following week, Ernesto made a copy and gave it to Gonzalo. Just in case anything happens, he told him, "You're always around here." Gonzalo took it without giving it any importance and kept it on his keychain. Nobody ever spoke of that key again. As for work, those same years of marriage were the ones of Ernesto's professional consolidation. The promotion to supervisor came in 2008 after an internal crisis at the factory that left several positions empty all at once, and Ernesto as the natural candidate, due to seniority and a track record of control reports that his direct boss defined in his evaluation as methodical to the point of being uncomfortable. It was a compliment and an observation at the same time. Ernesto knew it. He'd spent years developing the habit of writing down in a small pocket notebook any pattern he observed in the processes, dates, figures, frequencies, deviations, not because anyone asked him to, but because his head worked better when things were written and ordered. The notebook changed every time it filled up, always the same model, always in the inside pocket of his work jacket. That was the man she found that November afternoon, sitting in the armchair with the phone in his hand. A man with 24 years of marriage, a job he understood as a responsibility, and a best friend he'd loved like a brother since he was 18. A man who thought he knew the exact contours of his own life. What he still didn't know was how long he'd gone without seeing the details. The receipt appeared on a Wednesday morning, folded in 4 inside the inner pocket of Sun Tzu's purse. Ernesto wasn't looking for anything in that purse. He'd arrived late the night before from the factory with a dull pain in his lower back that had been warning for days it wasn't going to go away on its own, and he couldn't find his car keys. It was a habit of his that son Sauls had spent 24 years pointing out with patience that oscillated between resignation and genuine affection. He left things without looking where he left them: keys, phone, the reading glasses he'd started needing 2 years ago. That morning he checked the entryway table, the kitchen counter, the desk drawer, the jacket hanging on the back of the chair. Nothing. Son Sauls had already left. She'd left her purse on the entryway hook, as she always did when she went down to the mailbox for a moment without carrying it. Ernesto opened it without thinking, with the sole intention of checking if she'd mistakenly put his car keys in there along with hers. They weren't there, but when he put his hand into the inner fabric pocket, his fingers found a folded paper. He took it out automatically, thinking it would be some supermarket receipt she kept to do the month's accounting. He unfolded it on the kitchen counter. It was a hotel receipt. Palacio de los Diezmos Hotel, Avila. Date Saturday, October 8th, one night. Double room, 142 euros. Ernesto stood with the paper in his hand without moving. October 8th was the Saturday son Sauls told him she was going to spend the day with Marisol and Carmen, two friends from the group she met up with from time to time, to see an exhibition at the Salamanca Museum and then have dinner. She'd arrived past 11 at night. She told him the dinner dragged on, and she took a taxi so she wouldn't drive after drinking wine. He replied that it was fine, not to worry, and went to sleep. Avila wasn't Salamanca. Avila was a good hour away from Salamanca, and the receipt had a name: Son Sauls Medrano's y Fuentes. It wasn't a paper found by accident in someone else's pocket. It was hers, with her full name, at a hotel in Avila on the same night she supposedly had dinner in Salamanca with two friends. He folded the paper with the exact same creases it had, returned it to the inner pocket of the purse, and left the purse exactly where it was, on the entryway hook with the strap hanging on the same side. Then he found the car keys in the pocket of the jacket he'd checked 10 minutes earlier. He'd overlooked them because the back pain had reduced his concentration. He grabbed them, went out, closed the door, and didn't say anything to son Sauls when they crossed paths in the doorway. During the 22-minute drive to the factory, he didn't turn on the music. He drove with both hands on the wheel, and the receipt photographed in his memory with the fidelity that things that shouldn't exist have. Palacio de los Diezmos Hotel. Double room, Avila, 142 euros. It wasn't an accusation yet. It was data, and data on its own were loose pieces. He knew that well from his work. A part that doesn't meet the specification doesn't necessarily imply a failure of the entire process. It implies you have to keep looking. He had to gather more elements before concluding anything. That's what you did when an anomaly appeared. You documented it and continued observing without altering the environment. He took out his pocket notebook in the factory parking lot before getting out of the car. He wrote the date, the name of the hotel, the city, the amount, and the words night of October 8th to 9th. He closed the notebook, put it in the inside pocket of his work jacket, and went into his shift. The following days passed with a normality that Ernesto sustained with less effort than he expected. That surprised him about himself, the ease with which he could maintain his usual pace when he had a specific goal behind his eyes. The dinners, the after-dinner conversations, the nights in front of the television, everything as usual without visible variations. 2 decades of learning to detect flaws, without altering the processes surrounding them, apparently had applications that no manual had taught him. It was during that week when he began to revisit recent situations with a different attention, like someone rereading a document they read too fast the first time. He remembered a September afternoon, about 6 weeks before the receipt, when son Sauls came home with slightly damp hair, it being mid-afternoon on a Tuesday, a day she hadn't mentioned going anywhere. When Ernesto pointed it out, she replied she'd gone to the gym and that the shower at home took too long to heat the water. A completely reasonable explanation, the kind of answer that closes a question without leaving rough edges. But son Sauls' gym was 4 blocks away, and she had classes on Monday and Thursday mornings. Ernesto knew this because he was the one who took her sign up 3 years ago and who paid the monthly fee via direct debit. That detail only had weight now, backlit by the hotel paper. Before it was noise, now it was one more piece. He also remembered a call from Julio. They were both driving back from a dinner with some neighbors when Sansol's phone rang. She looked at it for a moment, silenced it without answering, and said it was her sister, that she'd call her the next day. Ernesto didn't pay it any more attention because Sansol's and her sister had a complicated relationship with schedules. But now what he remembered wasn't the explanation, but the gesture. The way Sansol's had turned the phone slightly before silencing it, angling the screen toward her own body before he could see the name that appeared. It was an almost imperceptible movement, the kind of gesture someone makes automatically when they've been training that reflex for a while without realizing they're doing it. Then came Friday's dinner. Adrian came to dinner fairly often when he came down for Valladolid for the weekend. He was 21 years old, in his final year of business administration, and lived in an apartment that Ernesto paid €680 a month in rent, car insurance, and a monthly transfer of $350 for regular expenses. An arrangement Ernesto himself had proposed when Adrian left because it seemed like the right thing to do and because he could afford it without compromising anything. Adrian was a reserved boy with that economy of words that the two men in that house shared, and that Sansol's sometimes pointed out, saying that living with two mutes ended up exhausting her. While Sansol's was in the kitchen finishing serving the plates, Ernesto said with a neutral tone of someone bringing up something of no great importance, that Gonzalo hadn't shown up at the apartment for weeks. "He didn't even come for your mother's birthday in September," he commented, looking at the tablecloth more than his son. In 25 years, he hadn't missed a single birthday of hers. Adrian's reaction lasted less than 3 seconds, but it had a specific texture. A brief silence, too restrained to be natural, followed by a shrug as he picked up his water glass. "Maybe he's tied up with work," he replied, and immediately added, without leaving space, "Did you see they say they're going to change the team's coach this month?" It was a change of subject so abrupt it had its own density, like a door slammed shut before the draft finished moving. Ernesto didn't pursue it. He looked up, nodded slightly, as if accepting the detour, and replied that he knew just enough about football to follow a conversation. Adrian exhaled with a naturalness that had too much preparation in it and kept drinking water. Sansol's came in with the plates, and the conversation drifted toward Adrian's pending exams and toward something that had happened that week at her work. Ernesto participated with just the right comments, so everything seemed in order, but he stored an exact place in his memory that slammed door, that overly quick shrug, that question about the coach that arrived before the previous sentence had finished cooling down. The moment of danger came after dinner. Sansol's went to the kitchen to make coffee, and Adrian and Ernesto were left alone in the dining room. Ernesto had his notebook on the table. He'd taken it out without thinking when he got home from work that afternoon and had left it open when he went to the bathroom for a moment, forgetting to close it. It was face up with the page visible, and on that page were written, in his tight, meticulous handwriting, the words he'd jotted down days ago. The name of the hotel, the city, the date, the room description, and the amount. Adrian looked at the table. His eyes passed over the notebook with a direction too specific to be casual. Ernesto saw at the exact instant it happened, a fraction of a second that generated a physical sensation in him before his brain finished processing the problem, something cold moving beneath his sternum. A nameless alarm signal. Ernesto put his forearm on the table, slowly, with a completely natural gesture of someone who simply rests their body weight while continuing a sentence, and covered the notebook without closing it. He kept talking about the traffic on the Valladolid highway, as if nothing had changed in the last 4 seconds. With the same tone, the same rhythm, Adrian looked away toward the window. He didn't say anything, but Ernesto knew exactly where he'd looked and how many words he'd managed to read before the arm got in the way. When Sansol's returned with the coffee, Ernesto closed the notebook and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket with an ordinary movement, without rushing. Nobody made any comments. The evening ended normally. Adrian left past 10, saying he had to get up early. That night, after Sansol's fell asleep, Ernesto sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time. He didn't turn on the lamp. He held the closed notebook in his hands, and thought about the speed with which Adrian had changed the subject when talking about Gonzalo, about the exact direction of his gaze on the table, about the years that son of his had been seeing things from a side that Ernesto hadn't considered. Because if Adrian knew something about Gonzalo and his mother and had chosen not to say anything all that time, that wasn't ignorance or ordinary cowardice. It was a choice made by a 21-year-old adult who perfectly knew the money Ernesto transferred his account every month, the rent he paid, the insurance he covered, and who had still decided to look the other way. That changed the weight of everything he hadn't yet found. The next morning, before leaving for the factory, Ernesto opened his bank statements from the last 2 years for the first time. Ernesto, there's milk expiring today. If you don't use it, I'm throwing it away. Sonsol's voice came from the kitchen with that practical cadence of someone announcing a domestic matter without expecting an elaborate answer. It was 8:20 in the morning, a Thursday. She had to leave at 9 to get to the office. She kept up the habit of preparing breakfast, even if they both ate in silence and in a hurry. And at that moment, Ernesto was sitting in front of the study computer with the bank statements of the last 24 months open on the screen and his pocket notebook spread out to his right. I'll use it, he replied with the exact tone of someone listening from another room with half his attention. Leave it in the fridge. A silence. The sound of a drawer closing. Sonsol's footsteps walking away toward the bedroom. Ernesto returned to the screen. The bank offered view of statements by categories that he'd never used until that morning because he'd never needed to look for anything in them with that kind of precision. But he'd spent 20 years learning to read data in columns, and the logic was the same as he applied at the factory. Filter the noise, isolate the relevant variables, look for anomalous behavioral patterns within a flow that seemed normal. Daily expenses formed a uniform and recognizable texture. Grocery shopping, the gas station, the pharmacy, direct debits, all that was background. What he was looking for was what stood out from the background. He started scrolling backward month by month, October 1st, then September, then August. The figures passed before his eyes at the right speed. He wasn't looking for the name of any particular hotel. He was looking for a pattern, charges in hospitality establishments outside Salamanca on dates that coincided with absences of Sonsol's that he could cross-check with his own memory or with the notebook entries. He found it in August. The charge appeared in the second week of the month. A restaurant in Segovia, 108 euros on a Saturday at noon. Ernesto read it once, then read it again. The Saturday of that week in August, Sonsol's had told him she was meeting Marisol and Carmen for lunch in Salamanca. She'd arrived mid-afternoon with a shopping bag from a clothing store that Ernesto hadn't linked to any anomaly, because the explanation that accompanied the bag was completely ordinary. She'd taken advantage to drop by the sales. He wrote the date and the establishment in the notebook. He kept going backward. July. A rural hotel in the Sierra de Bejar. 96 euros on a Friday afternoon. Ernesto remembered that Friday because he came home early, which didn't happen often, and found a note in the kitchen saying Sonsol's had gone to see her mother, and that dinner was in the fridge. Sonsol's mother lived in Salamanca, a 12-minute drive away. The Sierra de Bejar was an hour and a half away. The pen stopped on the paper. It wasn't a tremble, it was a halt, like when on the production line a part reaches the control station and the system detects something out of range and stops the advance for a fraction of a second before processing the alarm. His body received the information before his mind finished organizing it. Ernesto felt the weight of the pen between his fingers as if it had just increased. The computer monitor kept illuminating the room with that flat, shadowless light of white backgrounds, and the only sound was the heating on low, that soft, constant hum that in other circumstances would have been comforting. His gaze went to the year heading the July column, then to August's, then almost unintentionally to the blank space in his own notebook where the previous dates waited. And what the eye found before thought formulated, it was a regularity, not an isolated charge, not two separate coincidences, a discrete and consistent cadence that repeated with the frequency of something that's part of an established routine. An expense outside Salamanca every 3 or 4 weeks, always a Friday or Saturday, always in hospitality establishments, rural hotels, or restaurants of a certain category. Never excessively priced, never so low as to raise suspicions on a shared statement. The average amount he was building in the notebook column was around €100 per occasion. Nothing that seemed extraordinary in a normal monthly expense, nothing that triggered any alarms if looked at superficially. Only when those items were isolated from the rest and ordered chronologically did they appear as what they were, not loose expenses, but a fine, deliberate architecture designed not to be seen. He kept scrolling back. June, 2 charges, a hotel in Salamanca. Not their neighborhood, another hotel, €64 on a Friday night, and 4 days later a restaurant also in Salamanca, €83 Tuesday at noon, a workday when Sunsol said by message she'd eat near the office because she was very busy. May, a charge in Avila, a different establishment from the receipt he'd found in her purse, €116 Saturday. Ernesto stopped writing for a moment and counted the lines he had jotted down in the notebook. 17 entries in 5 months. It wasn't a recent affair. It wasn't something that had started a few weeks ago with the hesitation of new. It was a mature, well-oiled pattern, comfortable with itself. The behavior of something that's been working for a while and has found its cruising speed. He gripped the pen harder without realizing it. He kept going backward. April, March, February of the same year, the charges kept appearing with the same cadence, same type of establishment, same days of the week, same amounts within a range that didn't vary significantly. It was methodical, it was almost professional in its discretion, and that, more than anything else he'd found up to that moment, was what generated a new sensation in Ernesto, different from everything before. Not anger, yet something more like the cold recognition of someone who has been looking for nonconformities for years. And he just found one that isn't a process error, but a design flaw. Planned from the beginning, he went back to the previous year, and there, on an October afternoon 14 months ago, he found something he didn't expect, a charge that wasn't hospitality. It was an outgoing transfer from the joint account to an account whose last 4 digits he didn't recognize. 200 euros. The concept field blank. Ernesto looked at the final digits of that destination account, then looked at them again and opened a new tab in the browser to log into online banking with his personal credentials. He needed to know if that account appeared in any other transaction. That's when he heard the footsteps. They weren't Sansol's footsteps going toward the door with her coat on, which had a specific rhythm, the sound of the small heel against the hallway floor. There were slower footsteps that stopped, that approached in the direction of the study. Ernesto closed the bank tab in a single movement and opened instead a folder of work documents he had on the desktop, production reports from the previous week he had to review anyway, and whose presence on the screen was completely justifiable. He did it without taking his eyes off the screen, without changing his body position, without any gesture that marked the difference between what was on the screen 4 seconds ago and what was there now. The study door opened. Sunsols peeked in with her coat already on and her purse on her shoulder. She looked at him for a second. "I'm leaving," she said. "You have an afternoon shift today." "Afternoon, yes. I go in at 3. She nodded. Her gaze passed for an instant over the computer screen, in that distracted way someone looks at something they have no reason to be interested in, and then returned to him. "Are you eating at home then?" "Yes. There's yesterday's pasta in the fridge." "Good." Sunsols disappeared from the doorway. Ernesto heard her footsteps walking away toward the entryway, the sound of the ceramic bowl when grabbing the keys, the click of the lock, and then the silence of the apartment suddenly recovered, clean and without witnesses. He exhaled slowly. He hadn't been aware of holding his breath until he let it out. He waited 3 minutes before returning to online banking. It was a reasonable time to ensure Sunsols hadn't forgotten anything and was coming back up. He looked at the clock in the corner of the screen without really reading it, because what he had in his head wasn't the time, but the 4 digits of that destination account, and the question of whether the €200 transfer from 14 months ago was an isolated event or the first trace of something different from the hospitality expenses he'd been cataloging. When he reopened the statements and looked for that specific account among all the transactions of the last 2 years, he found it wasn't the only time it appeared. It appeared 6 more times, always the same account. always between 150 and 250 euros. Always with the concept field blank or with a single word that said nothing. Miscellaneous. Management. On one occasion, simply a dash. The dates didn't follow the same cadence as the hospitality expenses. They were more irregular, more spaced out, as if they responded to a specific need rather than a fixed routine. 7 transfers in 24 months to an account Ernesto didn't recognize, whose owner he didn't know, whose reason for existing in his statements had no explanation he could construct. He copied the 4 digits into the notebook below everything else and circled them. That afternoon, before starting his shift, he went by his bank branch. He told the teller he needed to verify an old charge on his account and that he didn't recognize the destination entity of a transfer. The teller checked the data with the professional neutrality of someone who has processed thousands of identical queries and informed him that the destination account belonged to the same banking entity. But to get information on the owner, he'd need formal authorization or a judicial request. Ernesto thanked him for the information, put away his notebook, and went out to the street. He still didn't know under whose name that account was registered, but he did know there was someone on the other side of those transfers, someone who received money from his marriage's joint account in discrete amounts and with no declared concept for at least 14 months, and that someone, whoever it was a piece the hospitality charges didn't explain on their own. The pattern was more complex than he'd calculated until that morning, and he still hadn't reached the bottom. The paper with the 4 digits of the unknown account had been in his notebook pocket folded inside the cover for 3 days when Ernesto walked into the factory's human resources office with the excuse of reviewing some seniority documents for a shift change request. It wasn't the excuse that interested him. It was the computer with access to the database of external suppliers and contractors the company worked with, a file he himself had partially audited the previous year during a cost review, and which included bank account numbers of individuals who provided occasional services. It was a long shot in the dark, but shots in the dark sometimes find something. He found nothing. The 4 digits didn't match any record. He discarded it without frustration and continued down another path. He'd spent a week building a spreadsheet on the study computer, always during the time Son Sauls was out or asleep, with all the information he'd extracted from the bank statements. He'd translated it to the format he used in his production reports. Dates in the first column, establishment in the second, location in the third, amount in the fourth, and in the fifth column he called declared justification, where he wrote, when he remembered, what Son Sauls had said she was doing that day. Most of the cells in that last column were empty because Son Sauls didn't always give explanations for her outings, and he hadn't asked for them either, because in 24 years of marriage, he'd never had a reason to ask. Those empty cells were in a way the most eloquent. When he finished entering all available data and sorted the table by date, the image that appeared had a clarity he found almost physically uncomfortable. 29 entries in the last 26 months, an average frequency of 1 external expense per month, with a higher concentration in the spring and summer months. The amounts ranged between 62 euros, the minimum he'd found, and 158, the maximum. The arithmetic mean gave 103 euros per entry. In 26 months, the accumulated expense in that specific column exceeded 2,900 euros, almost 3,000 euros on meetings outside Salamanca, spread over more than 2 years. A figure that, distributed over time and camouflaged among the daily expenses of a normal household economy, was practically invisible, exactly as it had been designed to be. And to that figure, he'd have to add the 7 transfers to the unknown account, which totaled 1,130 euros more. Ernesto closed the table, saved the file with a name that said nothing, part revision Lotnov, and protected it with the same password as the video. Then he stared at the blinking cursor on the screen for a moment. He wasn't calculating the money. That wasn't the number weighing on him. What he was measuring was the time. 26 months, more than 2 years of a structure functioning without a single visible flaw, without a single crack that will have reach him on its own. If it hadn't been for a video recorded at her request with her own phone in his own house, he'd still know nothing. That wasn't carelessness on Son Sauls' part, it was trust. She trusted for over 2 years that he wouldn't look, and she was right. He hadn't looked. The next step required an outsider. Ernesto knew this since he found the 4 digits of the unknown account, because that was a line he couldn't cross alone without leaving a trace or making a mistake that would alert Sunsols that something had changed. He needed someone with access or the means to obtain information he couldn't get through usual channels without raising questions. He searched for 2 afternoons on the internet carefully, using the browser in private mode and from his work computer, not his home one. He searched for family law firms in Salamanca, read reviews, checked websites with the same methodology he used to review machinery spec sheets. He was looking for something specific, someone not known in his circles, who had documented experience in divorce proceedings with asset investigation, and who wasn't linked to any name Sunsols might recognize. He found Beatriz Alcantara Fuentes, 44 years old, managing partner of a firm in downtown Salamanca, with 16 years of specialized practice in family and assets. Her professional profile included several resolution cases involving hidden asset investigation. Ernesto read her introduction page 3 times with the attention he paid to quality certificates from new suppliers, looking for the kind of language that distinguishes someone who knows what they're talking about from someone who simply advertises it. Beatriz Alcantara's language was precise and unadorned. That was enough for him. He called from his work phone on a Thursday morning, while the rest of the team was on the floor. He made an appointment for the following Tuesday at 5 in the afternoon, giving only his first name. The receptionist didn't ask additional questions. Meanwhile, the investigation by his own means continued. He took advantage of Saturday, when Sunsols went to see her mother, to physically check the filing cabinet where they kept household documents. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, but something that didn't fit. The kind of documentary anomaly they called third-category evidence at his work. Not direct proof, but an element whose presence or absence is significant in the context of the whole. He found 2 things he noted down. A business card from a hotel in Avila different from the receipt he'd found in the purse weeks ago, tucked behind some router instructions, and a small printed photo showing Sunsols in a garden Ernesto didn't recognize, holding a glass and wearing an expression that wasn't the one she wore when she knew she was being photographed. The photo had no date written on it. Ernesto photographed it with his phone and put it back in its place. On Tuesday at 5, he walked into Beatriz Alcantara's office. She was a woman of compact presence, with short dark hair and thin-rimmed glasses she took off and put on as she spoke, as if she used them more to think than to see. Ernesto laid out the situation in the order he had it organized in his notebook. The video, the hotel receipt, the statements, the table he'd built, the transfers to the unknown account. He handed her the notebook, open to the first page of notes. Beatriz Alcantara read it in silence, turning the pages carefully without interrupting him once. When she finished, she put the notebook on the table, took off her glasses, and said that what he'd built was more solid than what usually reached that office in an initial consultation. She explained that the transfers to the unknown account required a formal legal channel to identify the owner, which she could initiate the moment he gave the order. She spoke to him about the separation process with retroactive asset auditing and standard time frames. She clarified that the video, although recorded without the intention of documenting anything, was admissible as evidence in civil proceedings, provided it hadn't been obtained by any illegal method, which in this case it hadn't been because it was material owned by Ernesto himself recorded with his device in his home. She told him that what was in the notebook combined with the statements was enough to start the process, that he should continue documenting if he could, but what he already had wasn't insufficient. Ernesto listened to everything without interrupting, the way he listened to external audit reports of the factory. He asked 2 specific questions at the end. How long did the process take from the initial notification? And what happened to shared assets during the processing period? Beatriz Alcantara answered both with the same precision with which he'd formulated them. He left the office at 6:15 with a business card in his pocket and the orderly feeling of someone who's taken a step with no turning back, but which was calculated to have no turning back. That same afternoon, arriving home, he found Adrian's car parked on the street. It wasn't his usual visiting weekend. Ernesto walked up the stairs in normal pace and found his son in the living room with Sunsols, both with cups of coffee. The scene was completely ordinary, except for the fact that Adrian hadn't announced he was coming. "I had to pick up some notes I left here the other day," Adrian explained when Ernesto walked in. "I'll stay for dinner if I'm not intruding." "You're not intruding," Ernesto replied. He left his jacket on the back of the entryway chair without the notebook inside because that day he'd left it in his locker at work and went to change. Dinner went by with its usual calm. They talked about approaching exams, about a minor heating problem in Adrian's apartment in Valladolid, which would require a call to the landlord about something son Sauls had seen on television the night before. Ernesto participated in the conversation just enough to make it seem like an evening no different from any other. But during dessert, when son Sauls went to the kitchen to get the flan she'd prepared that afternoon, Adrian slid his eyes toward the jacket hanging on the back of the chair 2 meters from the table. It was the place where Ernesto always left his work jacket when he got home. And Adrian knew this because he'd seen him do it hundreds of times. His son's gaze landed on the inside pocket of the jacket, where the notebook would have been if Ernesto hadn't left it at the factory. It was a short glance, but with a directionality impossible to attribute to chance. Ernesto saw it from across the table without moving his head, using the peripheral viewing angle he'd spent years refining on the floor to detect movements on the line without the operators knowing he was watching them. Adrian brought his eyes back to the table the moment son Sauls pushed the kitchen door with her shoulder. He said nothing. He served the coffee with the same hand he'd used to sign a nonconformity report, calm, without emphasis, without letting a single muscle in his face register what he'd just seen, but what he'd seen was unmistakable. Adrian knew what he was looking for in that pocket, which meant Adrian knew there was something to look for. And that in turn meant that the notebook that was almost exposed at the previous dinner had left Adrian with enough information that weeks later he came to the house outside his usual schedule and looked in the jacket hanging on the back of the chair. Ernesto walked Adrian to the door when he left past 10. The two exchanged a kind of brief goodbye they'd shared forever. A handshake, a pat on the shoulder. Adrian walked down the stairs without looking back. Ernesto closed the door, rested his hand on the cold wood for a second, and thought about the owner of the unknown account that Beatriz Alcantara was going to identify starting the following week, because now he was certain that when that name appeared, he was going to recognize it. The phone rang at 8:30 in the evening on a Monday, and the name that appeared on the screen was the last one Ernesto expected to see at that time, Gonzalo. He looked at it for 3 full seconds. The screen stayed lit, the name was still there, and the phone kept vibrating with that mechanical insistence that doesn't know what it's interrupting. Ernesto was in the study with several documents spread across the table. Prep work he put away with a calm movement before picking up the device. He inhaled once, answered, "Ernesto, man, how are you?" Gonzalo's voice was exactly the same as always. That slightly relaxed tone with that familiar cadence Ernesto had recognized since he was 18 in any context, in a bar, at a funeral, in the municipal pool locker room where the two had gone for a season in the 90s. A voice carrying nothing because it didn't know it had anything to carry. "Good," Ernesto replied. "Here, reviewing some work papers. Same as always. Listen, I haven't seen you in weeks. How are things? Son Sauls and the boy all good? Adrian's dealing with final exams. Yeah, time flies. Listen, I want to propose we have lunch together someday this week, or next at that place on Pozo Amarillo Street. We still haven't gone." The living room across the hall was silent. Son Sauls had stepped out for a moment to a neighbor's house and wouldn't be long. Ernesto calculated that detail with the same part of his brain that kept listening to Gonzalo's voice. Proposing a day and time to eat together as if the last 26 months didn't exist, as if the video didn't exist, as if the table with 29 entries didn't exist, as if Ernesto didn't know exactly what that voice on the other end of the phone was right now. "Next week works better for me," Ernesto said. "I have a shift change this week. Next week then, Tuesday or Wednesday, whatever fits. Tell me Monday what's best for you." "Perfect. Listen, and give son Sauls a hug for me. It's been a while since I've seen her." Ernesto took exactly the same amount of time to answer that he would have taken any other day of the last 27 years. "I'll tell her." He hung up, put the phone on the table, face down, and stared at the wood for an unmeasured amount of time. 12 minutes the call had lasted, 12 minutes in which he'd responded with the right tone, the right rhythm, the silences in the right place, without a single audible flaw. It was the hardest thing he'd done in this whole process. Harder than opening the statements, harder than sitting across from Beatriz Alcantara, harder than having dinner with Adrian knowing what he knew, because with the statements and the law firm and the dinner, he hadn't had to use the voice of friendship as an instrument of containment. That night he didn't sleep. Sunsols fell asleep past midnight, and Ernesto stayed in bed staring at the ceiling for 40 minutes before accepting that sleep wasn't going to come. He got up without turning on any light, put on the clothes he had on the chair, and went out to the balcony. It was cold, that dry November cold in Salamanca that gets into your bones quietly without warning. He leaned on the railing with his hands shoved in his pockets and looked at the empty street for a while without thinking of anything specific. Then he thought of everything. He thought of a December afternoon 16 years ago when Adrian had a 40-degree fever 2 days before Christmas and Sunsols, and he spent the night at the hospital sitting in 2 plastic chairs pushed against the wall with their coats on because the pediatric ward's heating was failing in that wing. Ernesto remembered the cold of those chairs. He remembered the sound of the on-call staff's footsteps in the hallway, the building's dry antiseptic smell, and he remembered falling asleep at 3 in the morning with his head tilted towards Sunsols, who stayed awake staring at Adrian's room door. When he woke up at 5, she had her hand over his without mentioning it. She'd simply put it there sometime during those 2 hours and kept it there. That was real too. It had happened. He couldn't erase it from the inventory of what he knew about that woman, just because now there were other things in the same inventory that contradicted it. Memory didn't work with that kind of convenience. He took his phone out of his pocket and dialed Consuelo's number. It was 2:15 in the morning. His sister answered on the 3rd ring with the voice of someone not completely asleep, but not completely awake either. "Ernesto, what's wrong?" "Nothing urgent. Sorry for the time." A brief silence, then the sound of her sitting up in bed, a small lamp turning on, that recognizable atmosphere of an illuminated room in the early hours. "I've been noticing you acting strange for weeks," Consuelo said. "Tell me." Ernesto told her. Not everything, not with the notebook's level of detail, but enough. The video, the statements, the table, the name that still lacked official confirmation, but that he'd known since the night he zoomed in on the frame in the mirror. He spoke for 25 minutes, leaning on the balcony railing, the cold seeping through his jacket collar in a low voice so nothing would filter inside the apartment. Consuelo listened without interrupting except twice, at moments when the silence on the other end of the phone grew heavy with a density that was the same as if she had physically hugged him. When Ernesto finished, she took a few seconds to respond. "How long have you been carrying this?" "Just a few weeks." "You're just like Dad. You hold everything in until there's no room left to put it." A pause. "Are you okay?" "I'm holding together." "I didn't ask if you were holding together." Ernesto didn't answer that. Consuelo didn't push either, because they both knew that question had an answer that night's conversation couldn't sustain yet. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "For now, just to know and to not say anything." "All right, but if you need anything else, you call whatever time it is." He hung up 10 minutes later. The balcony's cold had achieved what the bedroom's ceiling couldn't, emptying him enough for his body to consider the possibility of resting. He went inside, undressed in silence, and lay on the edge of the bed with his back to Sunsols looking at the window. The second professional application came that same week, more specifically than he'd planned. Beatriz Alcantara had explained in the first consultation that in a separation process with a request for a property audit, it was advisable for the petitioner to have their own financial situation documented independently of shared assets. Ernesto understood the instruction with the immediacy of someone who already thinks in those terms. Separate the traceable from the shared, identify what he'd contributed individually, what existed before the marriage or came from his own inheritance, what was jointly acquired. It was exactly the same logic he applied when auditing component traceability on the production line. Every part with its documented origin, every process with its record, without ambiguities a third party could interpret to their convenience. He spent 2 afternoons in the study organizing that documentation. The apartment they lived in was jointly purchased with the mortgage paid off 5 years ago. The small savings account Ernesto kept solely in his name, an inheritance from his father who died 12 years ago, was already correctly documented as separate property. He reviewed life insurance, pension plan, work assets. He organized it all in a folder he took to Beatriz Alcantara's office for their second meeting on a Thursday afternoon. It was in that meeting that Beatriz Alcantara told him she'd made progress identifying the owner of the unknown account through the corresponding legal channels, but that the process required a few more days and she'd communicate the result as soon as she had final confirmation. Ernesto returned home from that meeting at 7 in the evening. He parked, rode up in the elevator, and was taking out his keys when he heard voices inside the apartment. One of them was son Saul's. The other took a second to identify, and when he did, his step halted. It was Adrian. Another unannounced visit, the second in 3 weeks, outside his usual pattern of alternating weekends. Ernesto opened the door with the same gesture as always. He hung his coat on the coat rack, left his keys in the ceramic bowl, and peeked into the living room. Adrian was sitting on the sofa with a cup of coffee, son Saul's across from him in the armchair. When Ernesto walked in, both looked up with timing that was too tight, like someone interrupting a conversation at the exact moment the person they were talking about arrives. "I didn't know you were coming today," Ernesto said. "I was passing by on my way to a friend's house," Adrian replied. "I stopped to say hi." Ernesto's work jacket, the one with the notebook in the inside pocket, hung at that moment from the entryway coat rack. Ernesto noticed at the very instant he saw the direction of Adrian's eyes move briefly toward the entrance hallway before returning to the coffee cup. A movement of less than 2 seconds. The kind of involuntary verification someone makes who is looking for something, who knows it exists, but doesn't know where it is right now. Ernesto went to the bedroom under the pretext of changing his shoes. He grabbed the notebook from the work jacket with a fluid movement as he passed the coat rack and put it directly into the nightstand drawer under a magazine. He returned to the living room, sat down, asked Adrian how his latest exams were going, and listened to the answer with appropriate attention. Half an hour later, Adrian left. This time he did look back before going down the stairs. A brief look at Ernesto, who stood in the doorway. Something in that look wasn't the usual goodbye. It had a texture more akin to evaluation, that of someone who still doesn't know if what they're doing is enough to stop something already in motion. Ernesto closed the door. The next day, first thing in the morning, he received a message from Beatriz Alcantara that said only, "We have the owner's name. Call me when you can." The account owner is Gonzalo Suarez Pedraza. Opening date, September 16th, 2 years and 4 months ago. Beatriz Alcantara's voice was the same as always, precise and without unnecessary inflection, but the silence she left after those 2 sentences carried a weight she probably calculated before speaking. Ernesto was in the factory parking lot, inside his car, with the engine off and the phone pressed to his ear. Outside, the morning was gray and cold, with that flat December light that casts no shadows and makes everything look slightly unreal. "Understood," Ernesto said. "Do you know him?" "Yes." Another brief silence. Beatriz Alcantara didn't ask who he was. She had enough experience to know that single-syllable answer contained a story he didn't need to tell right then. "The account was opened specifically to receive those transfers," she continued. "It has no other registered activity, except for the incoming funds from your joint account. It's a passive account created for a single purpose. That has implications for the process because it establishes documentable intent." Ernesto listened to the rest of the explanation with the same attention he'd given all previous ones. He noted down 2 dates Beatriz Alcantara mentioned as relevant to the procedure's timelines. When he hung up, he put his phone in his coat pocket and stared at the windshield for exactly 1 minute. Gonzalo Suarez Pedraza had opened a bank account 16 months ago to receive money transfers from Ernesto Villanueva's marriage. An account with no activity, save those entries. An account that didn't exist before the month. It was created and did nothing but receive. It was the structure of someone who doesn't improvise. The opening date was 2 months after the first hospitality charge outside Salamanca that Ernesto had found in the statements. which meant the first 2 months had probably been a trial period, the time when you check if the territory is safe before setting up something more permanent. 27 years of friendship with the economic architecture of a scam built on top. He went into his shift 10 minutes early, which was his usual margin, and spent the next 8 hours doing his job with his usual concentration. That was something he hadn't lost at any point in the last few weeks, the ability to compartmentalize. What belonged to work belonged to work. What belonged to the process he was handling belonged to hours outside the factory. The two compartments coexisted without cross-contamination because Ernesto hadn't allowed any leakage between them. It was exhausting in a way you couldn't see from the outside, but it was the only way not to make mistakes on either front. That afternoon, returning home, Sunsols was in the living room when he arrived. She had her laptop open on the table, and an expression of moderate concentration he knew well, the one she wore when looking for something specific and finding it. She looked up when she heard the key. "Hey," she said, "Marisol is asking me if I want to join a getaway the weekend of the 18th, a rural hotel in the mountains. She says Carmen is going too, and there's a free spot if I want." Ernesto was taking off his coat. He hung it on the coat rack with his usual gesture. "Which one is that?" "The long weekend. Friday the 18th, Saturday, and Sunday." "How many of you are going?" "Marisol, Carmen, and me, the usuals." Ernesto went toward the kitchen for a glass of water. From there, he said that sounded good, that she deserved it, that she'd been dealing with a lot of accumulated work lately. Sunsols replied something about yes, that she hadn't been out in a while, that disconnecting would be good for her. The conversation was exactly that ordinary, exactly that light. Back in the study, half an hour later, Ernesto opened the spreadsheet file he'd built with the bank statements and looked for the establishment name that appeared most frequently among the hospitality charges over the last 2 years. Senderos de Gredos Hotel, Sierra de Gredos. It had appeared 4 times in the records, always on a weekend, always in the same price range. It was the most repeated establishment in the whole table. The mountains, the long weekend on the 18th, a weekend, wasn't a coincidence. It was a date with an agreed-upon date presented as a spontaneous proposal from friends. Ernesto closed the file, opened the bottom desk drawer, where he kept the video backup on an external device Sunsols didn't know existed, and next to it the notebook with all the annotations from the last few weeks. He mentally reviewed the status of each element, the video in 2 copies, the notebook with 29 documented entries, the password-protected table on the computer, the 2 meetings with Beatriz Alcantara, and the folder of his own documentation he'd prepared which rested in the lawyer's office under their custody. The account owner's name, now legally confirmed. Everything in its place, everything traceable. It was enough, more than enough. He called Beatriz Alcantara first thing the next day and told her he wanted to set the formal notification date for the week after the long weekend. Tuesday the 21st. The lawyer took note and said she'd prepare the corresponding documentation for that date. She reminded him that upon notification joint assets became subject to the process's provisions and any relevant movement in the accounts during the interim period would also be registered. Ernesto said he understood. He hung up and dialed Consuelo's number. His sister answered on the second ring. Tuesday the 21st, Ernesto said. Without preamble, I want you to be available that day. A 2-second pause. I'll be available, Consuelo replied, and without asking anything else added, Are you okay? I'm ready, was the most honest answer he could give right then. The days leading up to the long weekend passed with a normality Ernesto had learned to inhabit as a functional space without trying to find it comfortable because it wasn't. Sunsols acted slightly more attentive than usual those days, the way people do when they're about to be absent, and compensate with more immediate presence, without realizing they're doing it. She made more elaborate dinners twice. One evening, she proposed watching a movie together she'd mentioned weeks ago and he'd said he wanted to see. Ernesto participated in all this with the equanimity of someone who no longer needs to interpret every gesture, because the complete map is drawn and additional details change nothing anymore. Thursday the 17th at night, eve of the long weekend, Sunsols took her suitcase out of the hall closet. It was a medium burgundy suitcase they used for weekend trips. Ernesto knew it well. because he was usually the one to get it down and put it back up on the top shelf where they kept it, too high for son Saul's to reach effortlessly. That night she'd gotten it down herself, probably while he was in the shower. She laid it open on the bed and began folding clothes with that meticulousness of hers Ernesto had observed hundreds of times. Each garment with its specific folds, shoes wrapped in cloth bags so as not to stain the clothes, toiletry bags sorted by size on one side. It was a ritual he knew by heart. He'd seen it before every trip, every family visit, every getaway in 24 years. The moment of danger came when he passed the bedroom on his way to the bathroom for a glass of water, because the kitchen was on the other side and the bathroom was closer. Son Saul's was bent over the suitcase, facing away, placing something in the inner side. On the bed, next to the open suitcase, she'd left her phone unlocked while her hands were full. The screen was on and showed a message conversation. Ernesto walked behind her toward the bathroom at a normal pace. As he passed, the angle allowed him to see the screen for less than 2 seconds. It wasn't enough to read the full text, but it was enough to distinguish two things. The contact name at the top of the conversation, which was the name he already knew, and in the last visible message, a line ending with what looked like a time and a location name. He got the glass of water, returned down the same hallway, and when he passed the bed again, the screen had turned off. Son Saul straightened up and looked at him. "Can you help me close this? It doesn't all fit right." Ernesto approached the suitcase, placed a hand on each side of the zipper, and closed it slowly, adjusting the contents with slight pressure so the fabric gave enough. Son Saul's held the other end. Her hands were 20 centimeters from his on the same suitcase. "There," Ernesto said. "Thanks." Son Saul's lifted the suitcase off the floor and propped it vertically next to the closet. "I'll leave tomorrow at 9. You don't need to get up. I'm getting up anyway. I'll make you coffee." She looked at him for an instant with an expression that wasn't exactly surprise, but was close. "Okay," she said. "Thanks." That night, Ernesto waited for Son Saul's breathing to become slow and regular before getting up with his usual care. He went to the study, turned on the computer, and drafted an email to Beatriz Alcantara with a single line. Confirmation for Tuesday the 21st. Time to be agreed upon at the office. He sent it, closed the laptop, and sat in the darkness of the study for a while. He thought about the time and location he'd seen on Son Saul's phone screen. He hadn't been able to read it completely, but it was enough to know there was more to that message than simply coordinating an arrival at a rural hotel. The text's visual structure, the formatting, the line lengths suggested it was a conversation with several back-and-forth messages, not a one-way notice. What he hadn't been able to read was the content of the previous messages in that same conversation, and that was the only thing still left out of the notebook. Son Saul's arrived on Sunday at 7 in the evening. Ernesto heard her from the study. The key in the lock, the weight of the burgundy suitcase dragged down the hall, the specific sound it made when propped next to the bedroom closet. He'd been alone in the apartment for 3 days. He'd used them well. On Friday, he'd taken the complete notebook and the copy of the external device with the video to Beatriz Alcantara's office, so everything would remain under the firm's custody before Tuesday's notification. On Saturday, he called Consuelo to confirm the time. On Sunday morning, he'd gone grocery shopping, prepared lunch, read the newspaper, and waited. It wasn't nervousness he felt. It was a kind of final stillness that processes have when all parameters are within range, and all that's left is for the cycle to complete its final phase. "Ernesto." Son Saul's voice came from the bedroom. "I'm home. I heard you." He replied from the study with an ordinary tone. "How was the weekend?" A 2-second pause. "Good. I needed to disconnect." "I'm glad." Ernesto got up from the study chair, picked up the living room TV remote he'd left on the desk that morning, and went to the living room. He turned on the TV, connected the HDMI cable to the laptop sitting on the dining table, and opened the video file. He paused it on the first frame, showing Son Saul's standing in front of the large bedroom mirror wearing the blue t-shirt and her hair tied back, smiling slightly at the camera. The exact same first frame as always, the one that would have seemed completely innocent if you didn't know what came next. Son Saul's walked into the living room, still wearing her coat, looked at the lit TV, looked at the laptop on the table, then looked at him. "What are you watching?" Ernesto didn't answer. He pressed play. The first 4 seconds of the video were Sun Sol's dancing facing forward, with background music and that serious concentration she put on when doing something that mattered to her. The same video she'd asked him to record, the same one he'd saved without knowing what it contained. The 5th second was when the figure in the mirror in the background became visible. The 6th, when the broad shoulders and unmistakable posture began to take shape. The 7th, when the silver wedding band on the hand holding the phone was framed sharply enough to leave no room for interpretation. Ernesto let the video play for 30 more seconds. 30 seconds in which Sun Sol's on the screen danced without knowing the mirror behind her was documenting everything behind that dance. And Sun Sol's in the living room watched the screen without moving, without saying anything, still wearing her coat and her purse still on her shoulder. Then Ernesto pressed pause. The living room's silence carried physical weight. The frozen image on the TV showed both of them. Her dancing in the foreground and him sitting on the bed in the background, reflected in the mirror, looking at his own phone with the tranquility of someone who is in a place they've been many times. "Ernesto." Sansol's voice was low, almost without volume. "You don't have to say anything yet," he said. He went to the dining table and opened the folder he'd prepared since Friday. He pulled out the printed pages of the table, the statements marked with the 29 entries, the documentation of the 7 transfers, and the legal confirmation of the destination account owner, and placed them on the table in the same order he'd organized them in the notebook over weeks. A clean column, no drama, no fuss. The presentation of someone who has invested time putting things in the right place. Sun Sol's dropped her purse on the armchair. She sat on the sofa. She didn't touch any of the papers. She looked at them from where she was, as if approaching them would confirm something that could still remain untrue if she didn't touch them. "How long have you known?" "Since November." A long silence. "The video," she said. It wasn't a question. It was the realization of something that had worked for over 2 years and had been undone by a file saved unreviewed in a phone's camera roll. "You asked me to record it," Ernesto replied. And he added nothing else because there was nothing else to add to that. What followed were not shouts. Ernesto had calculated this because he knew Sun Sol's and knew how she processed things that overwhelmed her inwardly with that specific restraint of someone who doesn't want to give more than they have to give. There is a moment of denial, brief and unconvincing of the kind that occurs not because the person believes what they're saying, but because the brain needs that second before accepting the ground has vanished. Then there was a long silence during which Sun Sol's stared at the papers on the table without picking them up. Then a negotiation attempt so small and poorly articulated that Ernesto let it die on its own without interrupting because she had no argument to offer, since the papers on the table had answered everything before she formulated any question. "Are you going to tell me you're sorry?" Ernesto asked at some point in that conversation. Sun Sol's looked at him. "I'm sorry," she said. And it was possible it was true, in the sense that things are felt when there's no longer any benefit in not feeling them. "I know you're sorry," he replied, "but that's not what we're going to talk about tonight." He explained to her what was going to happen on Tuesday, the lawyer's name, the process that would be initiated, the timelines Betrayal Contra had precisely explained to him in the 2 meetings. He spoke for 10 minutes without raising his voice once, with the same tone he used to explain a nonconformity process to his team at the factory. Clear, ordered, and without emotional garnishes that would distort the information. When he finished, he told her he was sleeping at Consuelo's house that night, and that Tuesday morning Betrayal Contra would make the formal notification. Sun Sol's didn't try to stop him. When Ernesto grabbed the bag he'd packed on Saturday and had kept in his car trunk since that morning, she was still sitting on the sofa with her hands on her knees, staring at the papers on the table. Ernesto stopped by the bedroom for a moment, went straight to the nightstand drawer on his side, and took out the small secondary keychain where he kept the spare apartment keys. There were 2 copies. He took the first, which was his. The second, which he'd given Gonzalo over 12 years ago, explaining it was for emergencies. It was no longer in that drawer. He'd recovered it 3 weeks ago, the night Gonzalo called him to propose lunch at the Pozo Amarillo Street restaurant. Ernesto had told him the next day that yes, Tuesday worked for him. They met. They ate for almost 2 hours with the usual conversation, the usual topics, the same 27-year cadence. When they finished at the restaurant door, as they were saying goodbye, Ernesto told him with the same tone he'd used to ask for a borrowed book back that he was changing the apartment lock, because home insurance required it to renew the policy, and if he had the copy, it would be good to get it back to give to the locksmith. Gonzalo took it off his keychain without comment. He put it in his hand. Ernesto put it in his pocket. They shook hands as usual, and each went their own way. That key was now in the study desk drawer inside a sealed envelope along with a note with the date it had been recovered. Closing documentation. The next day, Monday, Ernesto called Adrian. He didn't tell him over the phone what he was going to say. He asked if he could come by his parents' apartment that afternoon, that he needed to speak with him in person. Adrian arrived at 6, with a punctuality Ernesto felt belonged to someone who'd been waiting for that call for a while. Sunsols wasn't there. She'd left in the morning with a bag of clothes and hadn't returned. The apartment was silent. Adrian walked in, looked at the living room, noticed the absence without asking about it. He sat on the sofa where his mother had sat the night before. Ernesto sat across from him. "How long did you know?" Ernesto asked. Adrian took a while to answer. When he did, he didn't look away. 1.5 years more or less. Ernesto nodded once. He hadn't needed him to confirm it, but having it confirmed carried a different weight than suspecting it. "I found out by accident," Adrian continued. "I found something on Mom's phone when she lent it to me to make a call. I didn't look for it, but you didn't say anything either." A silence. "No. Well, I paid for your apartment, your car, and your monthly expenses. For 1.5 years. Adrian didn't answer that. There was no answer for that. It was arithmetic, not argument. Ernesto pulled out the folder he had ready on the table. 3 documents he placed one by one in front of Adrian with the same calm he'd placed the statements before Sunsols the night before. The first was the notification to the Valladolid apartment landlord canceling the payment contract from Ernesto effective in 30 days. The second was the letter to the vehicle insurance, communicating the cancellation of the policy he covered with the same effective date. The third was the receipt of the last monthly transfer of €350 already made with a handwritten marginal note that said final. Adrian read all 3 documents without touching them. When he finished, he looked up. "Are you going to give me a chance to explain myself?" "You've already explained yourself," Ernesto said. 1.5 years, and you chose to say nothing. That needs no further explanation." "She was your mother," Adrian said, his voice tighter. "I couldn't. She was my wife," Ernesto replied without harshness, without raising his tone, just with the weight of what it was. "And you're my son. You both had a choice. You both made it." He stood up, grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair. Adrian remained seated with the 3 documents in front of him and an expression that held inside, something resembling realization. Even if it came wrapped in layers of justification he hadn't yet finished dismantling. Ernesto saw it, didn't name it. At the door before leaving, he stopped for a moment. "When you're ready to talk without excuses," he said without fully turning around, "you know where to find me." He closed the door, walked down the stairs, as he always did, because the elevator took too long. He went out to the street. The December cold in Salamanca was clean and direct, without the humidity that made it unbearable in other cities. He walked to his car, opened the trunk, and took out the external device with a copy of the video Beatriz Alcantara already had replicated at the office, but which he'd wanted to keep as well. He held it in his hand for a moment. 2 minutes and 40 seconds recorded on a Tuesday afternoon, because Sunsols handed him her phone and told him to record her. He did it without thinking anything, without moving the framing, without noticing what was in the mirror in the background, because he had no reason to look for it. He saved it, passed it to her, and went on with what he was doing. He put the device in his coat's inside pocket and stood by his car, looking at the street for a moment. 24 years was too long to fit on any balance sheet. He wasn't going to try. What he could name with the exact same precision, he named. Everything else was what remained standing after the rest fell. The work he'd built with 20 years of patience, the sister who answered on the 3rd ring at 2 in the morning without demanding explanations. And the certainty which wasn't comfort, but was something solid to lean on, that he'd taken every step of the last few months exactly as it had to be taken, without shouting, without mistakes, without yielding 1 millimeter of the ground he'd built. In his car's mirror, he saw his own reflection for a second before getting in. He thought of the bedroom mirror, of what he'd seen it weeks ago, of how a flat piece of glass, without intention or judgment, had reflected an image that 2 years of careful architecture had managed to keep invisible. Mirrors don't lie. They simply reflect what's there. He started the car and drove away.